Hello everyone! We are halfway our labs. We have learned a lot about Canvas apps and Dataverse, and now we're going to be learning about model-driven apps. We are working on our device ordering scenario. We have built an app so the users can select from the list of devices and they can also order their device. We have been inserting also data into Dataverse that comes from the requests that the user will make. And now we are going to work with some of the backend processes related to the whole device ordering process. In procurement, there needs to happen a backend process. They need to set up the device and organize the distribution of the device that the employee is requesting. So for this, we're going to be using a model-driven app and also working with some business process flow. In this lab, we are going to understand model-driven apps. We are going to set up tables that we're going to use in that model-driven app. And also we are going to be created business process flow. We're going to see what they are for and where they can be used. And finally, we're going to work with forms and views. Without further ado, let's get started and let's switch to the web browser. Model-driven apps are generally used when we are setting up our data model first and then we set up our app. As you can see, when we were working with the Canvas app, we were designing every single stage and every single screen, every single click that the user is gonna do. Model-driven apps, on the other hand, we only set up the tables, we only set up the data model, and then we work on top of that data model to create an interface. And once we create that interface, that cannot be customized as much as it is customized for a Canvas app, because what Power Apps will do is take the setups that we do for that table, for that set of relationships, for those data that we are setting up, and based on that is going to create an interface for the user to interact with. And keep in mind that we cannot customize this as much as we can for Canvas apps. We are stuck with the design that Power Apps is gonna assign to our screens, but there are small things that we can do to make it look a little bit better. Now let's get started by going to create, and then here let's go to blank app, and we have gone through blank Canvas app at the beginning. We know what that is. We start with a blank screen and we start adding buttons, galleries, options, forms, and all of that, and that works perfectly fine. Then the second option that we get is blank app based on Dataverse, and that is actually a model-driven app. You can see here in the tag, that is how it's named. So for us to do this, we need to go to Dataverse first, create our tables, create relationships, create our views, and go through all of that steps, go through all of that design stage, and finally we come here to Dataverse to make those changes. We have already created tables for device orders in Dataverse. We're gonna be adding some new columns, so we work on this scenario, but keep in mind that if you're gonna work with a model-driven app, that is smart, secure, and low code, because for the Canvas apps we did a lot of customizations, we created a lot of things in the buttons, in the galleries, but for model-driven apps we're not gonna be coding that much. We are gonna be doing setups a lot. So let's go ahead and click on create here, and I'm gonna go with the classic app designer. That's gonna take me to a new tab, and then let's give it a minute for it to load. The first thing that it's gonna ask me is to assign a name to my app. We are going to name it device procurement. Then, as you can see, the unique name is gonna be automatically populated based on what I type in the display name. It's gonna give me a URL that I can use. And finally, I can select a different image if I don't like the default one. For this case, we're gonna leave it like that and work with that one. Now I'm gonna click on done, and let's give it a minute to load. This is the first thing that we're gonna see whenever we are working with model-driven apps. And the model-driven apps studio is composed by different components, and the first thing that we're gonna see is the sitemap. We can see as soon as we enter this screen that there's some configuration missing. This is because the sitemap is gonna define the navigation inside our app. So since we haven't done anything to this model-driven app, is asking us to do something so we can set up what do we want to show to the user, which tables, which areas, and all of that. So this is why the first thing that we see is a warning that we need to set up this area. We also have an area for dashboards that we select from the Dataverse. If you remember, we also have a tab for dashboards there. So this is where we set up this. And finally, we have an area for business process flow that we can set up. Then on this right side of the screen, we have everything that we can add to our model-driven app. We have entities, dashboards, business process flow, forms, views, charts, and dashboard. Keep in mind that a couple months ago, entities was the name that Dataverse was given to tables. So it may be that in some places you find the word entities, but that mainly refers to tables. Also, keep in mind that columns were also called fields back in the day. So if you find something that it's called field, it refers to the columns that we are already familiar with. Okay, so the first thing that we need to get going is click on this edit icon for the sitemap. So we're gonna get started with the setup of our app. And here we are going to, by default, have a new group created. So I'm gonna rename this to back office. Sorry, I'm gonna click first on the new area and then I'm gonna rename this to back office. Then I'm gonna go to the one that I just renamed as back office and name it orders. Okay, and then finally we are also going to edit this sub area and we're gonna name it device orders. Okay, so you can see how I get some warnings here in the right. That means that we need to do the setup before saving. Here we are going to change the type to entity. Keep in mind entities equal table. So whenever we select entities, in the next screen, what it's gonna happen, it's gonna ask us to select a table. Remember that in the previous lab, we created the device order where we are saving everything that our users are requesting from the app. So let's search for that table, and as soon as I start typing the name, it's gonna show up here on the right. So if I just select it, you're gonna see that it's gonna be automatically set up and linked to the table that we created. By default, the ID is set as new sub area. We can leave it like that, but it's really not best practice to leave those type of default names, especially if you're working with an app that is bigger, because in this case we're gonna have just a couple of screens and options. But if you're working with more or a bigger end-to-end process, you're gonna need to remember the names that you're assigning to each sub area. So in this case, we're gonna name it nav device order. Okay. Nav is because of the navigation, it's like a prefix. So now we are ready, and let's click on save. I'm gonna click publish. And once it loads, I'm gonna click on save and close. Then it will take me back to my model-driven app setup, and now that I have set up the sitemap, I no longer get that warning right here, and you can see how now it's allowing me to see everything that I have about this entity or table device orders. I have forms, views, charts, and dashboard, and I can go ahead and set up each of these items here. But really important is if I go to the sitemap and add more tables to my sitemap, they are gonna be listed right here. So that's important to keep in mind. I'm gonna click on save. Then I'm gonna click on publish, so my app is published. And I'm gonna click on validate. There's a warning found here, and it's telling me that the device order table doesn't have a reference form or view. We're gonna fix that in the next couple of steps, because we're gonna be working with the device orders table to add some columns and to create a form and all of that. And as you can see, this is a warning, not an actual error, so not necessarily it needs to stop us in the development of our app, because it doesn't necessarily it's gonna affect how the app is working. So I'm just gonna close it, and then I'm gonna quickly click on play so we can see how this is going. You're gonna see how great these model-driven apps are. With a couple of clicks, you can see how here in the right we have the orders. If you remember, that is what we set up in the sitemap, and we set up the sub area as device orders here as well. So this left side of the screen is what we were setting up in the sitemap. That is the navigation. If we would have set up more groups, we would see them here, and the areas is what we would have set up here so the users can click. You can see here that in the right side of the screen, it's adding by default all the rows that we have added from the app. Now it's showing me the active device orders, and if you remember, we had some views in our Dataverse when we were setting up the tables. We also saw the views. So for now, we only see those two columns because the active device orders only have those two columns, but we're gonna change that shortly, and we're gonna see more. So as you can see, very easily I created a view so I can see the information. If I open this here, it's gonna take me to a new screen where I can see the information. And for now, I only see the device name and the owner, and you can we're gonna see later how to change this as well. We can do edits from here, we can save. By default, it's creating a lot of options that I can use. I can create new items from here. If I go to new and I go to device name, and I can just device test, of course I'm gonna delete that in a couple of minutes. I'm gonna do save and close, and you can see just this lab is just like 15 minutes long so far, or 14, and with a couple of clicks, a couple of configurations, we have done a lot. So that's pretty great. We have even set up an option to create new records, so it's super easy, and that is why model-driven apps are important. When we are working on them, it's important to think first about the data, the tables, the setup, and then we go ahead and create the app, because this is really, setting up this is really easy once we have the data set up. So if we don't have the data set up, just like we have done here, we don't see all the columns. If I enter or I create a new, I don't see all the options that I should see, and that is because we still haven't gone through that step, but we're gonna do that right now. I even have an option to delete, as you can see here, so it's pretty great. Definitely working with model-driven apps is great because we only need to set up the data, and then pretty much Dataverse takes care of everything else. And another important note about model-driven apps is that they are fully responsive. So in Canvas apps, if we would like for users to be able to see the app from from their desktop or from their laptops or from their tablets or from their phone, we would have to use the responsive capabilities that Power Apps has and do it our own. But for the model-driven apps, they are by default responsive, so that's pretty great. Now I'm gonna close this, and then I'm gonna click here on Save and Close because it's time for us to do some setups in our table, so we can keep working in our model-driven app. So I'm just gonna click on Data. It may be here that here instead of data you see the word Dataverse. It depends a lot on the tenant that you're working on. And then I'm gonna go to tables. The purpose of this set of steps that we're going to work on is adding some columns that are gonna support the backend process that we have been talking about in the slides in the PowerPoint when we were introducing this lab. So the first column that we're gonna add is one called Capital Approved. So we're gonna write the name of the column, and then we're gonna set it up as a yes/no data type. So sorry, I went to the incorrect place. I need to go first to my table, so let's search for the table, and then I'm gonna click on new column. I was creating a new table instead. Okay, now here we are. Data type, I'm gonna select yes, no. Okay. So let's click done. We're also gonna create 4 more columns. One is gonna be device received. It's also gonna be a yes and no. We're gonna also work with device configured. That's a new column that we need to add. Data type yes, no. And then finally send survey. And yes, no. Yeah, actually there's one more. It's called device delivered. So I'm gonna go to add column, device delivered, yes, no, and then done. Now we are also going to add supplier order ID, and that's gonna be set up as text, so that's fine. So we're gonna do done. And then let's save table. So we have been adding all those columns because remember that once the user requests a device, it needs to go through a process in the procurement department, so they can request the device, make sure that it's delivered, get an order ID from the supplier, and there are some steps that need to run. We have talked about the manager approving the device once the user requests the device, but that's not the only thing that needs to happen. Procurement needs to take care of some parts of the process to ensure that everything works fine. So there are some steps that procurement will have to do right. So for that, we are going to take advantage of business process flows. And now we are going to go to here and open Power Automate. That's gonna take me to a new screen, and while it loads, let's talk a little bit about what this process needs to be. There are some different parts of this process that is mainly divided in 4 stages. The first one is device requested, then place order, receive device, and then distribute device. Device requested is currently in the company an email that is sent with the device request to the supplier. But going forward, it's gonna be this is gonna live in Dataverse, and it's gonna live in the device order table in a row where the user does the request. Then we're gonna work with the place order stage. So once they receive the request, they will place an order with the supplier and get an order ID. So we're gonna save that order ID in the table, in the column that we just set up a couple minutes ago. Then the next stage is the receive device, and this will occur once the device is received. So they're going to send it to the IT staff so they can configure it with the standard software for the company. The final stage is distribute device. So once IT setups or device, they are going to get it sent to the employee that requested it. And remember that we created a survey, a send survey column. That is because we are going to ask the employee to fill out a survey to make sure that they are happy with the device that they got. So we are working with the stages, and they are set up in a specified order. So we need to make sure that the procurement team makes this in the stages that we have defined. So for this specific scenario, we are going to define the receive device and distribute device stages as optional, and we can allow the user to skip them. So let's get started with our flow, and I'm gonna go to my flows, and from here we can go to business process flows and start a new one. But also we can go to flows from Power Apps and then start a new business process flow as well. So it's gonna be the same interface from both places. But I'm gonna do it from Power Automate, so I will just go ahead and create a new one. The first thing it's gonna ask me is what's the name of our flow. I'm gonna set it up to device procurement process, and the name, it's gonna be automatically populated with the same that we defined in our flow name. And then finally, it's gonna ask me which table is related to this process flow. So let's search for the device order table, select it, and then click on create. Okay, so you can see that it has been added here, and I'm gonna go to edit. That's gonna start the editor or the designer for this business process flow. Let's give it a minute to load, and we'll see how the designer looks.